The Hegemony Grand Council chamber smelled like copper and old stone. I know because they made me sit in the observation gallery for 6 hours without water, without food, and without anyone explaining why I was still alive. My name is Owen Carter. I was the last human diplomatic attaché in Hegemony space, and I was watching the vote that was supposed to end my species. The chamber was massive. The ceiling rose so high it disappeared into shadow. The council members sat in a curved arrangement of elevated seats, each one draped in the deep blue of Hegemony formal authority. There were 32 of them. I had memorized every face over the past 3 years of failed negotiations. War Chief Don, with his broad jaw and his habit of tapping his knuckle on the arm of his chair. Counselor Preth, who never looked at the humans across the table when he spoke, as if doing so would somehow diminish him. And then, at the far left end of the curve, Elder Vaketh. The elder was old in a way that made the others look temporary. His skin had gone pale at the edges, his posture was slightly bent, and he moved with the deliberate slowness of someone who had learned that rushing was a form of waste. He had been on the council for longer than most of the current members had been alive. He had seen wars begin, and he had seen wars end. I had spoken with him twice during the negotiations. Both times, he had asked me questions the others never thought to ask. Things like, what do humans do when they have already lost everything? And, is it true your species invents stories specifically to frighten your own children, and then teaches them that the frightening thing can be defeated? I had not understood why those questions mattered. I was beginning to understand now. The debate had been going for 2 hours by the time I was brought to the gallery. I could not hear the words clearly, but I had a translation device that fed into a small receiver behind my ear. The signal was patchy, but I caught enough. War Chief Don was speaking. He wanted a full response. Not just a rejection of our surrender terms, but a complete and final action against the remaining human colonies. He called it resolution. He said the word with great satisfaction, the way someone says a word they have been saving. 2 other counselors supported him. They used phrases like the cost of hesitation and the lesson of finality. I had heard those phrases before, in the early months of the war, when the hegemony was still surprised that humans were fighting back at all. They had not expected us to last 6 months. We had lasted 3 years. I think that fact had moved from being impressive to being offensive somewhere along the way. It had become personal to them, this war. And personal wars are won not by the strongest but by the most patient. Elder Vaketh raised his hand to speak. The chamber went quiet in the particular way that a room goes quiet when the person speaking is someone the others have learned to half respect and half ignore. They listened to him the way people listen to old warnings they have already decided not to follow. I pressed the receiver harder against my ear. The elder began by saying he had no interest in being dramatic. He said he was going to share something he had learned from 20 years of studying humanity, and that the council was free to do whatever it wanted with the information. His tone was calm. It reminded me of someone describing the weather. He said that humanity, across every era of its recorded history, had a pattern that no other species in hegemony contact had ever demonstrated. He called it the mercy trap. He explained it this way: when humans extend mercy to an enemy, it is almost never an act of kindness. It is an act of measurement. They are not releasing you because they are weak. They are releasing you because they want to know what you do with the freedom they gave you. And while you are busy celebrating the gift, they are watching, and learning, and preparing. He said the human surrender terms were not terms at all. They were an invitation to become careless. The chamber was still. Even War Chief Don had stopped tapping his knuckle. The elder continued. He said he had read human military history in the original language, with help from a human linguist who had not known what the elder intended to do with the knowledge. He had read about a concept humans called the long game. He had read about generals who lost battles deliberately to win wars. He had read about a human tendency, unique among all species the hegemony had ever encountered, to treat defeat as a form of strategy. He said he did not know exactly what humanity was planning. But he said he was certain, with every year of experience he had, that humanity was planning something. And that if the council voted to reject the surrender terms and proceed with full action against the remaining colonies, they would not be ending the war. They would be removing the last reason for humanity to hold back whatever it had been preparing. He sat down. The chamber stayed quiet for about 4 seconds. Then War Chief Don laughed. It was not a cruel laugh. It was the laugh of someone who has just heard something so far outside their way of thinking that their body did not know how else to respond. 3 other counselors smiled. Counselor Preth finally looked directly at something, though what he looked at was the ceiling. One of the younger council members, a woman named Counselor Vell, who had made her position on the war very clear from the beginning, said something that the translation caught only partially. What I heard was, "A shadow frightened by moonlight." A few of the others nodded or made sounds of agreement. The elder did not respond. He simply looked at his hands. The vote was called. I watched each light on the display panel above the curved seats. Red for proceed with full action, white for accept the surrender terms. The lights came on one by one. Red. 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 White, from the elder. Red. 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 31 red. 1 white. The order was passed. Orbital action against the remaining human colonies was scheduled to begin within 72 hours. The council members stood and began to speak to one another in the relaxed way that people speak after a decision has been made and the work is someone else's problem now. The elder stood alone. He did not join the conversations around him. He gathered his papers slowly, with the same deliberate movements he always used, and he walked toward the exit at the lower end of the chamber. Before he passed through the door, he stopped. He turned and looked up at the observation gallery. He looked directly at me. I do not know how he knew exactly where I was sitting in that long gallery of empty seats and hegemony observers. But he found me without hesitation, across the full distance of that massive room, and he held my gaze for what felt like a long time but was probably less than 3 seconds. Then he mouthed 2 words. I read lips well. It is a skill you develop when you spend years in rooms where you are not supposed to understand what is being said. The words were, "I'm sorry. Not sorry for us." I understood that much, even then. He was not apologizing to me for what the council had just decided. He was apologizing for them. For the fact that he had tried, and that no one had listened, and that whatever was coming next was now unavoidable. I sat in that gallery for another hour before anyone came to escort me out. I used the time to send one encoded message through a channel the hegemony had never found, because it was hidden inside the timing gaps of routine atmospheric data from a weather satellite. The message was 4 words. The door is open. That was the signal. That was all it needed to be. I did not know everything that would happen next. But I knew what those 4 words meant to the people waiting to receive them. I knew what had been prepared. I knew what patience looked like when it finally exhaled. And I sat in the gallery of the Hegemony Grand Council, and I waited for the next chapter of a story they did not know had already been written. The thing about a plan that depends on appearing defeated is that it requires everyone involved to actually feel the weight of what they are pretending. You cannot look like someone who has given up unless part of you has considered it seriously. I want to be honest about that, because I have read accounts of this period that make it sound clean and clever, and it was not. It was the hardest thing my species has ever done, and it was done by ordinary people who were quietly terrified every single day. Let me go back to the beginning. Not the beginning of the war, but the beginning of the decision that changed it. My name is Owen Carter. I was 29 when the hegemony made first contact. I was 36 when the war started. I was 39 when the Strategic Command of the Earth Defense Coalition met in a bunker under the Canadian Shield and made a choice that I was not allowed to know about for another 8 months. I will tell you what they decided, and then I will tell you what it cost. The coalition had been fighting the hegemony for 3 years. In that time, we had lost 60% of our outer colony presence, 2/3 of our forward fleet capacity, and more people than I am willing to put a number to in a document that will be read by people who may have lost someone in those years. We were not losing slowly. We were losing the way a fire loses when you cut off its air. We were still burning, but the end was visible. The conventional options had been exhausted. Every general, every strategist, every analyst who had spent their career modeling conflicts had come to the same conclusion. In a direct engagement, at the current rate of attrition, humanity had between 14 and 20 months before our capacity to defend any populated world would effectively reach zero. 14 to 20 months. Those were the numbers on the table in that bunker. Admiral Grace Holloway was the one who asked the question that changed everything. She had commanded the fleet action at the Kepler Belt, which we had lost, and before that the defense of the Meridian stations, which we had also lost, but in both cases she had extracted her forces with fewer losses than anyone thought possible. She was known for a very specific kind of thinking, the kind that looks at a situation and asks not how do we win this but what does winning actually require. She asked, what if we stopped fighting the war we are losing and started fighting a different war entirely? The room was quiet for a moment. Then she laid it out. The hegemony was a powerful military force, but it had a weakness that we had identified early and never fully exploited. It was not a weakness of technology or numbers. It was a weakness of imagination. The hegemony had never, in its entire recorded history, encountered an enemy that surrendered as a strategic act. Their entire military doctrine was built on the assumption that surrender meant the end of a conflict. You fought, you won, or you lost, and then it was over. The concept of using a surrender as a starting position for the next phase of a conflict was, to them, literally unthinkable. It was not that they would disbelieve it if someone told them. It was that the idea would not connect to anything in their experience. It would pass through their thinking like light through glass, leaving no impression. Admiral Holloway proposed what was formally designated as Operation Long Patience. Informally, those of us who eventually learned of it called it the open door. The core of the plan had 3 parts. The first part was dispersal. Every asset that mattered, every ship, every weapons cache, every technical specialist, every piece of infrastructure that could be moved, would be relocated to positions outside the hegemony's known mapping of human space. Not retreated, relocated. There is a difference. A retreat goes backward along the same line you came from. A relocation goes sideways, quietly, to places no one is looking. The hegemony had good intelligence on our military positions because we had been fighting from those positions for 3 years. We were going to abandon every single one of them, deliberately, and let the hegemony find them empty. We were going to let them think they had pushed us back to nothing. The second part was infiltration. In the months before the surrender was announced, small teams of specialists were to be embedded into hegemony space under civilian cover. Traders, researchers, cultural exchange participants, all categories the hegemony allowed with minimal screening because they had never had reason to suspect them. These teams would not take any action for a minimum of 12 months after the surrender. They would simply be there, watching, learning the rhythms of each system they were placed in, identifying vulnerabilities, and reporting back through channels so quiet they made ordinary silence seem loud. The third part was the hardest. It was restraint. Restraint meant that once the surrender was announced, nothing happened. No actions, no provocations, no demonstrations of capability. Humanity would simply be still. And the hegemony would do what comfortable, victorious powers always do. They would relax. They would reassign resources. They would begin the long institutional process of converting from a war footing to a post-war administration. And with every month that passed without incident, they would become slightly more certain that the war was truly over. The plan required patience on a scale that is difficult to explain to someone who has not been asked to practice it under those conditions. Because it was not just the military that had to hold still. It was everyone. The colonies that were used to make the surrender look real, and I will not minimize what that means, they were real communities with real people, and the losses there were genuine. The plan depended on those losses being visible and significant enough to convince the hegemony that we had nothing left. We did not manufacture suffering. We allowed it to be seen. I am aware of how that sounds. I have spent years thinking about how it sounds. I was told about the plan 8 months after it began. I was selected for the diplomatic attaché role specifically because my cover required me to be visibly present in hegemony space, apparently powerless, apparently just a formality. A human face at a table that no longer mattered. The hegemony found my presence mildly useful as a symbol of the peace they believed they had won. I found their comfort extremely useful for other reasons. I carried very little information. That was intentional. If I was questioned, I could truthfully say I did not know the locations of the dispersed fleets, because I did not. I did not know the identities of more than 3 of the embedded teams, because I had not been told. What I knew was the signal, the 4-word phrase that meant the preparation phase was ending and the next phase was beginning. The day I sat in the Hegemony Grand Council gallery and watched them reject the surrender terms, I understood something that I had only partially understood before. Elder Vaketh had already seen this coming. He had warned them not because he thought they would listen, but because he understood that once they rejected the terms, there would be no more pauses, no more waiting, no more open doors left unconsidered. The rejection was the event the plan had been waiting for. It confirmed that diplomacy had been genuinely exhausted, that humanity had offered a real path to peace and it had been refused, and that whatever came next was not aggression but consequence. I sent the 4-word signal from the gallery because I had authorization to do so the moment the vote concluded. The message traveled through the weather satellite timing channel, bounced through 2 relay points so distant that tracking the full path would have taken the hegemony longer than the message took to act on, and within 19 minutes it had reached the first of the 11 network nodes that would cascade the signal outward to every waiting team, every dormant cell, every hidden position that had been sitting in patient silence for 18 months. 18 months of maintenance. 18 months of perfect readiness, maintained not because anyone was forcing it but because the people involved understood exactly what they were waiting for and refused to let the waiting make them soft. I left the gallery that evening escorted by 2 hegemony security personnel who treated me with the distant politeness of people managing something they considered resolved. I was taken to the residential compound where I had been living for the past several months, a comfortable set of rooms that were also, almost certainly, monitored. I ate the meal that was brought to me. I sat by the window and watched the lights of the Hegemony Capital complex glow against the dark sky. I thought about Admiral Halloway, who I had met only once, at a briefing, and who had a way of explaining impossible things in a voice so level it made them sound inevitable. I thought about the colonies we had sacrificed to the appearance of loss. I thought about Elder Vaketh, walking alone out of that chamber, not looking back at his colleagues. I thought about the word patient, which in English comes from a root that means to endure suffering. I had always thought of patience as a quiet thing, a still thing, a thing that waited without moving. But that night, looking out at the Hegemony Capital, I understood that patience is not stillness. Patience is action that has not yet arrived at its moment. It is a river that has not yet reached the sea. It is a held breath that has not yet become a word. Somewhere in the dark beyond that city, in positions scattered across hegemony space that no hegemony sensor had ever found, human teams were reading my signal. They were checking equipment that had been checked 100 times before. They were looking at one another across small rooms and closed spaces, and they were nodding, because there was nothing to say that the nod did not already say. The door, which the hegemony had slammed shut with 31 red lights, was about to be opened again. Only this time, it would be opened from the inside. Colonel Diane Ford had a habit of drinking her tea cold. She said she had given up on hot tea during the first year of the war, when there was never enough time to let anything cool properly, and now she preferred it cold because it reminded her of the years when she had been too busy to be afraid. I know this because I shared an office with her for 11 of the 18 months that fell between the surrender announcement and what we eventually called the day of disclosure. The office was not really an office. It was a converted cargo bay on a mid-range civilian transport vessel called the Aldwin, which spent those 18 months running a genuinely legitimate freight route between 3 hegemony border systems. The freight was real. The crew was real. The manifest checked out every single time hegemony customs inspected it, which happened 4 times. What was not in any manifest was the small secondary compartment behind the water processing unit, where Diane and I and a man named Paul Gray worked in rotating shifts keeping track of every embedded team in hegemony space. Paul Gray was 24 years old. He had been a mathematics student before the war, and he had a talent for pattern recognition that the coalition had identified early and redirected entirely. He could look at a column of routine atmospheric sensor readings from a hegemony border station and tell you whether the station had shifted its patrol schedule in the last 48 hours. He was quiet in the way that very focused people are quiet, not because they have nothing to say but because they are always slightly more interested in the problem than in the conversation. Diane ran our cell. I was her contact with the broader signal network. Paul was our analyst. For 18 months, our job was to watch the hegemony breathe. That is the best way I can describe it. Every day, Paul would compile the incoming data from the network of embedded teams and present Diane and me with a picture of hegemony military and civilian activity across the systems we covered. And for 18 months, the picture showed the same thing, in gradually deepening detail. The hegemony was exhaling. It started in the third month after the surrender. The first reports came in from the team embedded at the hegemony's primary logistics hub at a system they called Varka and we called Station 40. The hub had been running at full wartime capacity since before the conflict began. In month 3, it reduced its processing throughput by 12%. In month 5, by an additional 19%. By month 9, the hub was running at just over half its wartime capacity. In month 6, the hegemony announced the mothballing of 2 of its 6 reserve fleet stations. In month 8, border patrol routes in the outer sectors were consolidated from 3 overlapping sweeps per cycle to 1. In month 10, the Hegemony Council formally approved a budget reallocation that moved significant resources from military operations to what their documents called post-war infrastructure development. War Chief Don, the man who had laughed at Elder Vaketha's warning and called him a shadow frightened by moonlight, announced in month 11 that he was stepping down from the council to pursue what the hegemony press described as civic leadership opportunities. He was running for governor of one of the hegemony's core administrative provinces. His campaign materials talked about peace dividends and the new era. Paul showed me one of his campaign broadcasts, intercepted by a team near the provincial capital. Don looked comfortable. He looked like a man who was certain that the most difficult part of his life was already behind him. Paul watched the broadcast with his usual stillness. Then he said, very quietly, "Good." I understood what he meant. Every month that Don spent thinking about provincial administration was a month that Don was not thinking about what might still be out there. Diane read the reports every morning and made notes in a small paper notebook that she kept in her jacket pocket. I asked her once why she used paper when everything could be recorded digitally. She said paper could not be remotely accessed. She said the only truly secure data was data that required someone to physically take it from you. I thought about that a great deal in the months that followed. It was in month 7 that I made my secret visit to Elder Vaketh. After the vote, the elder had submitted his resignation from the council. It was accepted without ceremony. He had then traveled to a border moon called Vethkai, which was technically hegemony territory but so far from the populated core that it functioned more like a place the hegemony had once claimed and subsequently forgotten. It was cold there. The atmosphere was thin enough that you needed a filtered breathing mask outside the settlement. I had authorization for a single personal visit under my diplomatic cover. The hegemony did not find it suspicious because they considered me essentially harmless. A diplomatic attaché whose government no longer existed in any meaningful form, visiting an elderly retired counselor on a forgotten moon. From their perspective, it was 2 irrelevant people talking about a finished war. I traveled there on a supply run, arrived at the small settlement in the mid-afternoon of that moon's long day, and found Elder Vaketh in a modest home at the edge of the settlement, drinking something warm and reading from what appeared to be an extremely old book. He was not surprised to see me. I had the feeling he had been expecting someone, if not specifically me. We sat across a small table. He poured me something warm. I did not ask what it was, and he did not explain. Outside the window, the thin atmosphere moved over pale gray rock. I asked him how he had known. How, before the war, before the negotiations, before all of it, he had arrived at such a precise understanding of what humanity was doing. He thought for a moment. Then he said that understanding was perhaps too strong a word. He had not understood humanity. He had recognized a pattern that humanity shared with a very specific type of thing he had observed in his life. He said that in nature, across every world the hegemony had ever mapped with living things on it, the most dangerous predators were not the largest or the fastest. They were the ones that could choose not to act. The ones that could watch, and wait, and hold their capability in reserve, and make the deliberate decision to release rather than consume. That capacity for chosen restraint, he said, was the rarest and most significant capability any living thing could develop. It meant the creature had a model of the future. It meant the creature was capable of sacrifice in the present for gain in the future. It meant the creature was, in the deepest sense, strategic rather than reactive. He said that in his 20 years of studying humanity, the one thing that had stood out above everything else was not our technology, not our numbers, not our stubbornness, though he acknowledged all of those. It was the fact that we regularly chose not to do things we were capable of doing, specifically because we were thinking about what came after. He said every other species the hegemony had encountered either fought or surrendered when pushed far enough. Humanity, as far as he had been able to determine, had a third option. It calculated. I asked him if he had informed anyone beyond the council of his concerns. He was quiet for a longer time than I expected. Then he said that he had done something that would probably surprise me, and that he hoped I would understand it in the spirit in which it was intended. He told me that 14 months before the council vote, while the war was still in its conventional phase and the surrender had not yet been proposed, he had composed a private message to the Earth Defense Coalition's Strategic Command. Not through diplomatic channels, which he knew were monitored. Through a route I will not describe here, because I still do not fully understand how he managed it, and because some things are better left as evidence of capability rather than explanation. The message had been simple. It said that the council would reject any surrender offer regardless of terms, because the war faction had the numbers and the popular support to override any moderation, and that the only path to a genuine peace was one that made the war faction understand that the war had never actually been within their control. He said he did not know what shape that path would take. But he said he wanted whoever was reading the message to have what he considered a fair warning of the obstacle, so that they could plan accordingly. He looked at me across the small table. He said he had not known whether the message would reach anyone useful, or whether it would simply vanish into the noise of a communications war. But he said he had suspected, based on everything he had read and learned, that humanity would find a way to use it if it arrived. I sat with that for a moment. Then I understood. Admiral Holloway's question in the bunker, the one that changed everything. What does winning actually require? She had not arrived at that question in a vacuum. She had arrived at it because she had been told, by the council member who would cast the single dissenting vote, that the front door was locked and that if humanity wanted to end this war, it would need to come in through a window that did not officially exist. Elder Vaketh had given us the 18 months. Not by warning the council. By warning us. I looked at him for a long time. He looked back with the patient steadiness of someone who has said what needed to be said and is now simply waiting for the listener to finish processing it. Outside, the thin wind moved over the pale gray rock. I finished my drink. It tasted like something between tea and smoke, and it warmed me in a way that stayed with me on the long journey back to the Aldwyn and the cold office behind the water processing unit where Paul Gray was watching a hegemony border patrol reduce its route for the third time in a month. Diane was awake when I returned. She looked at me over her cold tea and said nothing, because she had learned to read the particular expression I got when something had shifted in my understanding of a situation. I sat down. I told her what the elder had said. She was quiet for a moment. Then she wrote something in her small paper notebook. She did not show me what it was. She put the notebook back in her jacket pocket and picked up her tea. On month 16, the hegemony decommissioned a 3rd Reserve Fleet station. On month 17, War Chief Don won his provincial election with 62% of the vote. On month 18, the day I had been told to count to, I looked at Paul and Paul looked at Diane and Diane put down her cold tea and said, "Let's begin. I will tell you about the morning it happened. Not the planning, not the months of preparation, but the morning itself, because I was awake for all of it and I have never described it in this level of detail to anyone outside the people who were there. I was on the Aldwyn. It was the last week of the 18th month. The ship was running its usual freight route, moving between the border systems the way it had been moving for a year and a half, quiet and unremarkable and exactly what its manifest said it was. Paul Gray had been awake for 31 hours. Diane Ford was on her 3rd cold tea. I had slept for 4 hours and felt as though I had not slept at all. The signal that went out from the network that night, the final coordination pulse that said today is the day, had been 17 months in the writing. Every embedded team had received the plan in fragments, delivered through different channels at different times, each piece meaningless without the others, each piece stored in ways that would leave no trace if discovered. The full picture only assembled itself in the last 48 hours before execution, when the final fragments were released. I want to explain what the plan actually was, because every account I have read describes it as an attack, and it was not an attack. It was a demonstration. And the difference between those two things is the entire point of the story I am trying to tell. Humanity's embedded teams, across more than 200 positions throughout hegemony space, had spent 18 months identifying every significant vulnerability in hegemony infrastructure, Power relay stations. Water processing hubs. Communication network nodes. Transport coordination centers. The kinds of systems that, if disrupted at the right moments, would not cause suffering but would cause silence. The hegemony would go quiet. Every system would know that something had happened, but nothing would be destroyed, nothing would be damaged, nothing would be permanently altered. For approximately 90 seconds, the hegemony's primary communication network across 7 core systems would experience a coordinated interruption. During those 90 seconds, every hegemony-linked screen and speaker in those systems would carry a single transmission. The transmission was a human voice. Calm, unhurried, speaking in the hegemony's primary language with a clarity that the translation software had spent months perfecting. The voice said, "This message is being delivered at a moment of our choosing, using systems that have been accessible to us for the past 18 months. We are not delivering this message to cause alarm. We are delivering it to provide information." What follows is a complete record of every facility, installation, and system in hegemony space that a human team has had direct access to since the day your council rejected our surrender terms. Then it listed them. It took 4 minutes. The list was precise. It included dates, access points, duration of access, and, in several cases, the name of the hegemony official who had been in the facility on the day of access and had no idea. At the end of the list, the voice said, none of these facilities were damaged. None of these systems were compromised. None of the individuals named in this record were harmed or threatened. This record exists to demonstrate one thing only. That for the past 18 months, we have been inside your space, inside your systems, and inside your security perimeter, and we chose to do nothing. That choice was not an accident. It was not a limitation. It was a decision. We are extending to you, again, the same offer we extended before your council's vote. The terms are unchanged. We are asking you to read them again. And then the transmission ended and the hegemony's communication network came back online, and the silence that followed it was the loudest thing I have ever been part of. I was monitoring network traffic from the Aldwin secondary compartment. Paul had a display showing the real-time response signatures from the major hegemony population centers. For the first 3 minutes after the transmission ended, the response signatures showed something that Paul had never seen in 18 months of watching hegemony data. He showed me the display and pointed to a pattern in the signal density. That pattern meant that millions of hegemony citizens were accessing the same information simultaneously and not communicating about it. They were reading. They were watching. They were absorbing. And then, one by one, they were going very still. The hegemony's public communication channels, which Paul monitored through a passive capture system, erupted about 4 minutes after the transmission. The volume of traffic was extraordinary. But it was not the traffic of panic. It was the traffic of people trying to understand something that had just reframed everything they thought they knew about the past year and a half. Diane was watching a secondary feed. She turned to me and said that the council was convening an emergency session. I nodded. I had expected that. What I had not expected, and what Paul found when he was pulling data from the council's administrative systems 40 minutes later, was the report about War Chief Don. The embedded team assigned to Don's flagship, a vessel called the Vethandar, had been aborted 11 times in the previous 14 months. On the day of disclosure, 4 hours after the transmission, they boarded it for the 12th time. The ship was docked at the provincial capital where Don had recently won his election. 6 people, carrying no weapons, simply walked through the access points the team had mapped months earlier. They delivered a data chip to Don's command chair. The chip contained a complete log. Every approach route his flagship had taken in the past year. Every defensive gap in its patrol pattern. Every moment when the ship had been positioned in a way that would have made it accessible. Every moment when it had not. Every decision the embedded team had made, over 14 months, to do nothing when they had the capability to do otherwise. They left. The ship's security system did not register their presence because they had spent 14 months learning exactly how to move through it. Don was found by his own staff 2 hours later. He was sitting at his command chair, reading. According to the account I eventually obtained, he read the entire log, all 14 months of it, twice. He did not speak for some time. Then he asked his communications officer to contact the Grand Council on his behalf. He said he needed to submit a formal statement in support of the human terms. There were 30 other situations like it across hegemony space that day. Not all of them involved former war chiefs. Some involved supply commanders, station administrators, communications directors. Each one had received something personal. Not a threat. A record. A history of access and chosen restraint that made the same point in the most direct language possible. We were there. We chose not to act. That choice is the offer we are making you. The Hegemony Council's emergency session lasted 9 hours. I followed it through intercepts and through Paul's data analysis. The mood in the chamber was, by all accounts, one that the hegemony political press would later spend years trying to describe accurately. The closest translation I ever found was the phrase stunned reckoning, which is not quite right in hegemony either, but is closer than any alternative. At the 4-hour mark of the session, an aide walked to the acting chair's position and delivered a message in the quiet way that aides deliver messages when the content of the message is significant but the manner of delivery needs to remain composed. The acting chair read it. He stood. He said, in a voice that Paul's monitoring equipment picked up clearly, "Recall Elder Vaketh." I heard that and I put my hand on the edge of the display table and I did not move for a moment. Diane noticed. She looked at me. I told her what had been said. She nodded once, slowly, the way she nodded when something confirmed what she had expected without making her feel good about being right. The human terms were transmitted to the council the following morning. They were not, as I think many people on both sides expected, punitive. They did not demand territory. They did not demand the dismantling of hegemony military structures. They did not include reparations designed to cripple. The terms were, in the language of Admiral Halloway, who had drafted them herself, proportionate to the goal. Recognition of human sovereignty over all human worlds, including those that had suffered during the conflict. A joint commission to oversee the reparations process for affected colonies, with hegemony contributions structured over 20 years to avoid economic destabilization. Free passage for human vessels through hegemony space, reciprocal, under a shared navigation protocol. A cultural and scientific exchange program. And one final clause, the one that the hegemony's translation team reportedly had to read 4 times before they were confident they had rendered it correctly. A joint defense treaty, proposed by humanity, under which hegemony and human forces would share intelligence and coordinate responses to threats from beyond either civilization's current mapped space. Humanity was not asking to be left alone. It was asking to be a partner. I read the terms in that cargo bay, on the Aldwin, with Paul Gray leaning over my shoulder and Diane Ford holding her cold tea and not drinking it. And I thought about the Elder, in his small home on the cold moon, telling me that humanity was the only species he had ever studied that calculated rather than reacted. That could hold capability in reserve in service of something that had not happened yet. The terms were a demonstration of exactly that capacity. We had the capability to make the hegemony situation far worse. We chose not to use it. We chose instead to offer something that would take years to build but would, if it worked, mean that we would never have to have a version of this conversation with anyone ever again. The Hegemony Council voted on the terms 3 days later. 29 yes. 2 abstentions. 1 member absent, having submitted a written statement of support in lieu of attendance, because he was in a provincial capital reading a 14-month log on his command chair. The war that had taken 3 years to almost end us was over in a vote that lasted 11 minutes. Paul Gray turned off his monitoring display. It was the first time I had seen him turn it off voluntarily in 18 months. Diane Ford finished her cold tea. I looked out the small porthole above the display table, at the particular darkness of deep space that looks the same everywhere you go, and I thought about the word patience. About what it costs. About what it is capable of building when it is given enough time and enough people willing to hold it. I thought about 31 red lights and 1 white one. I thought about 2 words, mouthed across a massive chamber by an old man who had known what was coming and had tried, in his own way, to ensure it did not have to be as painful as it might have been. I thought, we made it. And then Paul, who almost never initiated conversation, said quietly and without looking up from his now dark display, "What do we do next?" And Diane, without missing a beat, without a single pause, said, "We start building the thing we just promised them." And that, I think, is the truest possible ending to a war. The treaty signing ceremony was held on a station that had not existed 8 months earlier. That fact matters more than it might seem. The hegemony had proposed using one of their established diplomatic facilities. Humanity had countered with the suggestion of neutral ground. The compromise, arrived at after 6 weeks of back and forth between delegations that were still, in those early months, cautious with each other, was to build something new. A joint construction project. A station neither party had prior claimed to, assembled by teams from both civilizations working in shifts, using components from both supply chains. It took 4 months. It was not impressive, as stations go. It was functional and compact and slightly mismatched in the places where hegemony construction standards and human construction standards met and negotiated their differences in the language of bolts and sealants. But it was ours, in the specific way that something is yours when you have made it together with someone you are still learning to trust. My name is Owen Carter. I was part of the human delegation that traveled to that station for the signing. I had not been home in more than 2 years. I had spent those years living in a converted cargo bay, watching hegemony data streams with Paul Gray and drinking cold tea with Diane Ford, and before that living in a monitored residential compound in the hegemony capital, and before that traveling between failed negotiations in the slow erosion of a war that had almost taken everything. I had been home for 11 days before the delegation departed. 11 days was not enough time to feel entirely like a person again, but it was enough time to remember what a full night of sleep felt like, and what food tasted like when someone made it without the constant awareness that tomorrow might require a different kind of energy than today did. The station was called, in human records, Joint Station 1. The hegemony called it something that translated, depending on the dialect, as either the new threshold or the place we begin from. I preferred the hegemony name. I arrived on a shuttle with the rest of the delegation 2 days before the ceremony. The station smelled of new seals and recycled air and something faintly sweet that I later learned was a hegemony cleaning compound they used on freshly installed surfaces. The corridors were a little narrow for human proportions in some sections and a little wide in others, evidence of the two construction standards finding their way around each other. The hegemony delegation had arrived the day before. Our first joint session was a coordination meeting to finalize the order of the ceremony. It was technically procedural. In practice, it was the first time the two delegations had sat in the same room without a war running in the background, and the procedural nature of it was exactly what made it possible. When you are discussing the placement of signature blocks on a document, you do not have to navigate the larger weight of everything that brought you to the table. You can simply work. I sat across from a hegemony cultural attaché named Counselor Reen, who had the specific focused energy of someone who took logistical details very seriously and had opinions about the correct font size for treaty documents. We agreed on most things. Where we disagreed, we found a middle position without much difficulty. At the end of the meeting, as people were gathering their materials and preparing to leave, Reen said to me, in a tone that was careful and genuinely curious, "Was it always the plan to offer the Joint Defense Clause?" I said yes. I said it had always been part of the terms. Reen was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "We spent some time discussing whether it was a calculated pressure point. Whether you were offering something you knew we would feel obligated to accept." I said that was a fair thing to wonder. He said, "What was the conclusion on your side? Why include it?" I thought about how to answer that. The truthful answer was complex and had several layers, and not all of them were things I could explain to someone I had met 2 days earlier. But the simplest layer was also the truest one. I said, because the same things that almost ended us might still be out there. And we would rather face them with you than without you. Reen looked at me for a moment. Then he nodded, not the nod of agreement exactly, more the nod of someone who has just received information they are going to think about for a long time. I have thought about that exchange many times since. The ceremony itself was held in the largest room on the station, which was not very large. The delegation stood on either side of a central table. The document was read aloud in both languages. It was long. Treaty documents are always long, because precision is a form of respect when the stakes are high, and leaving anything ambiguous would have been its own kind of carelessness after everything it had taken to get here. Elder Vaketh was in the hegemony delegation. He had accepted the role of special advisor at the council's specific request, the first time in hegemony history that a resigned council member had been invited back in any official capacity. He stood slightly apart from the main group, the way he had always stood, slightly separate from the current of whatever room he was in. He was wearing formal hegemony dress and looked more like himself than he had in the small house on the cold moon, or perhaps it was just that knowing more of his story made him read differently to me. After the signatures were complete and the delegations were relaxing into the kind of careful social interaction that follows formal events, I made my way to where the elder was standing. He saw me coming. He waited with the stillness that was simply his natural state. I said, "I know about the message you sent to our strategic command." He said, "I suspected you might, eventually." I said, "I want to understand why you did it. Not the strategic reasoning." "I understand the strategic reasoning. I mean the other part. The risk you took. If the Council had found out you had communicated with the enemy during active conflict, the consequences would have been serious." He looked at me with the particular expression I had come to associate with him, the expression of someone who has already thought through the thing you are asking about and arrived at a place of quiet certainty. He said, "I have spent my life studying what happens when capable people choose the wrong moment to act, or fail to act when the moment is right. What I have learned is that there is a very narrow window, in any escalating situation, during which an outside voice can still change the direction of events. That window existed at the time I sent the message. I calculated that the chance of the message reaching someone who could use it was low. I calculated that the cost of sending it, if it was discovered, was significant but survivable. I calculated that the cost of not sending it, if the war continued to its most likely conclusion, was permanent. Those calculations did not leave me much choice. I said, "You gave us the time we needed." He said, "You were already planning." I simply removed one uncertainty from the problem you were solving. I said, "That is a modest way to describe it." He said, "It is an accurate way to describe it. The capability was yours. The patience was yours. The decision to offer partnership rather than demand submission was yours. I provided one piece of information at one moment. Your species did everything else." I looked at him for a long moment. The room around us was filled with the careful noise of two civilizations learning how to stand in the same space without filling the silence with every difficult thing that had happened. I said, "Can I ask you one more thing?" He said, "Yes." I said, "In your message to our command, what did you say, exactly?" I was told the message existed but I was never shown the full content. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I said that I had studied humanity for 20 years and I had come to a conclusion that no other member of the Council shared. I said the conclusion was this: your species is the only one I have ever encountered that wins wars in order to stop having them. I said I believed that if given the right conditions, humanity would choose a peace that cost you something over a victory that cost the hegemony everything. I said I was giving you those conditions to the best of my ability, and that I hoped you would prove me right." The room was full of sound around us. 2 delegations, 50 people at least, finding the small talk of historic occasions. I thought about Admiral Grace Halloway in a bunker under the Canadian Shield, asking the question that changed everything. I thought about Paul Gray, 24 years old, turning off his monitoring display for the first time in 18 months. I thought about Diane Ford and her cold tea and her paper notebook. I thought about the colonies. I always thought about the colonies. I would think about them for the rest of my life. I thought about 31 red lights, and 1 white one, and an old man mouthing 2 words across a massive room. I said to the elder, "You were right." He nodded once. It was a small nod. He looked out at the room with the expression of someone who is satisfied by a thing without needing to make anything more of it than it is. We stood there for a while without speaking, which felt entirely appropriate. 3 days after the ceremony, back on Earth, I processed a cultural exchange application. It was the 100th application I had processed since the program launched, but this one stopped me. The applicant was a hegemony citizen from a provincial capital. The application form was filled out in standard hegemony administrative print, clean and precise, every field completed correctly. The applicant's listed profession was former military fleet command. The applicant's reason for applying was given as, to better understand the civilization I spent 3 years underestimating. At the bottom of the form, below the signature line, in small handwritten hegemony script, someone had added a single word. It was not part of the required fields. It was just there, in the margin, like a note someone had written to themselves and then decided to leave. I looked it up in 3 different translation references to make sure I had it right. All 3 gave the same answer. The word meant, understood. I approved the application. I put the form in a physical folder that I kept in the bottom drawer of my desk, separate from the digital records. Diane had been right about paper. Some things were better kept in a form that required someone to physically reach for them. I took it out sometimes, in the years that followed. On days when the work of building what we had promised was slow, or difficult, or when the distance between what we had hoped for and what was actually possible felt very large. I would take out that form and look at that single word in the margin and remember what it had taken to get from a gallery in the hegemony Grand Council to a cramped cargo bay to a new station that smelled of sealant and two civilizations trying something neither of them had ever tried before. I would remember the elder's voice, precise and calm, in a small house on a cold moon. Your species wins wars in order to stop having them. I would think, yes. That is what we were trying to do. That is what we are still trying to do. Every day, in every application, in every joint session, in every corridor of Joint Station 1 where two kinds of construction standards are still negotiating their differences in the language of bolts and sealants, that is what this is. I would put the form back in the folder. I would put the folder back in the drawer. And then I would go back to work.